I've had a few questions recently about how I scan film, about my process. So I thought I'd make a brief video looking not just at my technique, but also some of the key principles for how to get great film scans at home, whatever your setup. Before I go any further, I should point out that I am definitely no expert on this subject. Anything I know about scanning film has just come through practice and lots of online research. There's so many great videos on YouTube about scanning film, from people like Nick Carver, Kyle McDougall. Check out their videos, do some research yourself. Especially if you're new to the whole subject of scanning film, there's a lot to learn. Before I dive into my process though, I thought it might be good just to talk about three realities or three home truths of scanning film at home. Something that I've picked up along the way. The first is that scanning film is hard. Lots of people are selling Lightroom and Photoshop plugins or film carriers for use with camera scanning. And sometimes the marketing can make it look like you'll pick up one of these plugins and pick up a film carrier and within a couple of minutes be getting perfect quality scans. And in my experience, that's just not the reality. It does take some time. It does take some practice. Scanning is a skill, ultimately. But don't be discouraged. With a bit of work and a bit of effort, it is possible to get great scans at home, whatever your setup. Hopefully this video will help to cover some of these principles, these things that we're looking to achieve to get good scans and make your life a little bit easier. The second home truth of scanning is that scans are subjective. A lot of us, myself included, fall into this trap of, especially when we start out, thinking that there's a correct way to scan film or a correct scan. That a certain piece of film should only have one look and we're trying to achieve that look. The reality though is that negative film, black and white or colour, can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. Now whether you're printing it traditionally in a darkroom or getting a digital scan, what we're really looking for is not a correct scan, but a scan that's pleasing to us. Something that we like, a result that we're happy with. It can be easy to fall into the trap of thinking that portrait that gives nice pastel colours and soft tones, and ectar that's contrasty and saturated, so that's the exact look we have to go for. Well, I think those stereotypes, if you like, are probably the average, the mean result of many types of scanner and many different scanning techniques. If 100 people scan a piece of portrait, the average result will be soft pastel colours. But that doesn't mean it's what you have to do, and it doesn't necessarily mean that's what you're going to get when you first attempt scans either. So be patient and keep working towards a result that you're happy with. The third home truth of scanning is that it does take time. I think in most fields there's something like this expression. Cheap, good, fast. Pick two. And scanning's no different. If you've got the money for a professional scanner like a Noritsu or a Pacom or something along those lines, then chances are you're going to get great scans fairly quickly. Again, probably with some practice. But for the rest of us, using camera scanning or a flatbed like an Epson, a flatbed scanner, well, it does take a little bit of time to get good results. Okay, with that said, let's dive into my process. I should start by saying that lots of people using Epson scanners or any kind of dedicated film scanner, and that's what I'm using an Epson V750, will be doing a conversion as they scan. So using something like the Epson scan software or Silverfast, they get the converted negative right out of the scanning software. And the results from that can be fantastic. Some of my favourite scanners, Nick Carver, Brett Curry, they get awesome colours, lovely tones using Silverfast and an Epson flatbed, an Epson V750, I believe. So that's definitely one way to go. But in my experience, I found that I prefer a three-step method or a three-stage method. So that's capture, conversion, and edit. We start by capturing a digital image of the negative, then we convert it separately, and finally we edit the image to something that we're happy to present, whether it's on social media or through a print. So the first stage of that process is to capture. What's the goal of a good scan, a good capture? Well, whatever hardware we're using, whether it's a camera or a dedicated scanner, and I'm not here, by the way, to give a recommendation. You need to do some research if you're in the market, because each has its own benefits. Personally, I use an Epson V750, but that's just because it's what I have access to. It doesn't actually belong to me. I'm able to borrow it on a regular basis, which is very, very generous. But either way, it doesn't really matter. We're aiming for the same result. We want maximum information in the negative with minimal nasties. And what do we mean by nasties? Things like dust spots, flares or light leaks, and anything where the negative isn't sharp. So perhaps the negative is being curved and that narrow plane of focus is skimming through only a certain area of the negative. We want to avoid that. Instead, we want, as we said, maximum information. So lots of information in the shadows and the highlights of the negative. And we want a sharp negative, or rather I should say a detailed scan of the negative. Now, sharpness itself is a tricky subject, and we'll touch on it more a little bit later. But at this stage, we don't necessarily need a sharp scan, we need a detailed scan. We'll talk about that again in a few minutes. So that's the goal. Lots of information, minimal nasties. How do we achieve it? Well, one of the key things is to have a flat, dust-free negative before we ever begin. If you get your film developed in a lab, you might have limited control over this. But for many of us developing at home, one of the keys I've found is the way we dry the negatives. So what I like to do is, when I get to the last stage of my development process, run into the bathroom, turn the shower on as high as it'll go, as hot as it'll go, and close the door for a couple of minutes. Then hang the film to dry in the bathroom. That moisture in the air, the humidity and the warm atmosphere, I've found really helps the negative to dry nice and flat. If it's too cold, it can curve in one direction. If it's too hot, it can curve in the other. But by having a humid, warm room, usually it does lead to a nice flat negative. And the side benefit of that is any dust in the air gets damped right down. So we should also end up with a relatively dust-free negative. Once we've got our nice flat dust-free negatives, we need to load them carefully into our scanner. There's all sorts of film holders on the market for camera scanning and even for flatbeds. Now, people online have done back-to-back tests and you can go and check some of those out. Personally though, I find that the included Epson film trays are perfectly adequate if we've dried the film so that it's nice and flat, and if we make good use of something like a rocket blower, or a microfiber cloth can be useful too, just to make sure there's as little dust as possible on the negatives before we load them. Another tip here is to use some nitrile gloves when we're handling the film. It just helps to avoid any fingerprints, any grease that might mess up the film. Okay, so we've got the film loaded into the scanner with no curves, no bends, no creases in the film, no dust and no fingerprints. Next, we need to nail our scan settings. Let's jump into Epson Scan and see how I use Epson Scan with my flatbed scanner to get a good digital file ready for conversion. If you're using a digital camera or a different scanner or a different piece of scanning software, the principles might be a little bit different. But I'd suggest checking out the Negative Lab Pro website. They've got really good information on how to get a nice flat, as in by flat I mean lacking in contrast, a nice low contrast scan, whatever technique you're using. Okay, so now we're ready to jump onto the computer and capture, convert and edit our scan. I mentioned earlier that I'm using an Epson V750. You could be using a different film scanner or of course camera scanning, and this process might be a little bit different for you, but hopefully the principles will apply. For me, I use Epson Scan software to get that initial capture. There's other options, even for Epson scanners. ViewScan, Silverfast, they can provide great results. But Epson Scan is free, it's fairly easy to use, and realistically it does everything we need. I think if you use ViewScan or Silverfast, it can be a little bit easier to get the flat, low contrast scan that we're looking for here. Maybe we can skip a step or two, but it's perfectly possible just with the Epson Scan software. So let's jump in and have a look at how we've got this set up. The first thing we need is our Epson Scan software to be in professional mode. that gives us all the options we're going to be using today. The second thing we want to do is come down to the configuration tab and turn off continuous auto exposure. Instead, we want to set the display gamma to 2.2. Now, auto exposure in the scanner can have a use. For a very under or very overexposed negative, it can help to compensate things a little bit. But as we already mentioned, in terms of, or rather for getting good scans, for getting great colours out of colour scans and great tones out of black and white scans, often correct exposure is actually really important. So for me, I try and expose fairly accurately. I usually use a light meter, or a spot meter rather, that gives me pretty accurate exposures. And then I find that with a fixed exposure setting rather than auto exposure, I've got a more consistent capture and I'm able to judge more precisely what I'll get from my scan. But of course, it might depend on the image that you're scanning, so your mileage may vary, let's say. For this process though, we're going to have our display gamma set to 2.2. Close that. The next thing to look at is up here. Now, although this is a black and white negative film that we're scanning today, I'm actually setting it to positive film. So do you remember, rather than scanning and converting in the same software and in the same process, we're actually going to scan a positive image of the film, a literal representation of the negative in digital form, and then do the conversion a little bit later. If this was colour film, I'd have it set to 48-bit colour. Of course, we're scanning black and white today, so I've got 16-bit grayscale. For resolution, well, this is up to you. For this scanner, 2400 seems to be about right, 3200 sometimes if I'm going to print or display a little bit larger. And that's about it. That's all we want to set up. Any of these additional adjustments that we can do to the scan in the software, we're going to leave. We certainly want to avoid adding a sharpening mask in this software. Again, we're looking for detail in the scan, but not sharpening, not yet. We'll sharpen a little bit later. This is black and white film, so we can't use the digital ice technology. But on colour film, you definitely want to be using digital ice. It's the automatic dust removal using an infrared channel. We've already said that removing dust, getting rid of those nasties, is a really important step. And so I've tried to get the film as dust-free in the film carrier as possible. But of course, you're always going to have a few little bits left over, so the digital ice technology is excellent. And for me, is one of the big advantages of using a flatbed over camera scanning. It doesn't make much difference for black and white though, to be fair. Okay, so with those basic things set up, we're going to go ahead and select our film area. You can, if you want, use the automatic thumbnail mode in Epson Scan, but I find this is a little bit more accurate. It means we don't miss out any edges of our film. And you can also include a little bit of the border, which will come in handy later. So, we've got our film area selected. The only adjustment we need to make before scanning is to come in here to image adjustments and bring the contrast down. We're going to aim for about -27. Now, this particular detail is lifted from the Negative Lab Pro, the Negative Lab Pro instruction page. They suggest that for creating a flat, low contrast scan for conversion later in Epson Scan software, then it's a good idea to bring the contrast down a little bit. I've played around, used a few different settings, and I find about -26, 27 gives a good result. This is black and white film, so we're not going to touch the saturation. But for colour film, I also find bringing the saturation down a touch can help. -2, -3 is enough, just to knock the edge off the saturation in the initial conversion, giving us a little bit more headroom for natural edits a bit later on. It's always easier to add contrast and add saturation after than it is to take them away. Good, we're ready. Now if I was scanning this for real, I'd go ahead and select the rest of the frames, like so. Unfortunately, the Epson Scan software is a little bit annoying. It doesn't set a global contrast setting, so you'd have to go and change this for all of the frames. It takes a couple of minutes, but it's not the end of the world. We'd do that for all of our film, and we'd hit Scan, choose a file location, etc. In this case, I'm not going to do that because I've already got scans of these images, and that's what I'll use when we're editing and show you how it works. The only thing that we would need to set, and I can show you that actually, is that we're going to have this set to TIFF. We want a TIFF file rather than a JPEG. That's going to bring as much detail and as much information as possible into our conversion software. Once we've got a nice clean scan, as in a capture of the negative, a digital version of the negative, next we need to do our conversion. As I mentioned earlier, we're not doing a conversion in the scanning software. That can give good results, but in my experience, there is a slightly better way, or at least it gives me better results. The ultimate goal of a good conversion is to give natural, editable files as quickly as possible. Some conversion software can give a nice looking image, but it's already got loads of contrast and saturation, and when we try and edit it a little bit further to achieve what we feel is an accurate scan, it can just get a little bit crunchy. And some conversion software adds in too much sharpening, or the wrong type of sharpening, and that's also something we want to avoid. Now I should say that the latest version of Negative Lab Pro, you've probably heard of it, it's a plugin for Lightroom, is really great. It does a fantastic job in the tests I've done. And it gives lots of control right there in the plugin. But personally, I've been using Grain to Pixel. I'll put a note in the description, or a link to the website. It's a Photoshop plugin. It's a little bit rough around the edges in places, and it doesn't give us so much control, which can at times lead to a few little quirks. For example, I have noticed on very high contrast images, it can clip the highlights a little bit. And sometimes in color images, it leaves the white balance a little bit cool and a little bit green. But despite those limitations, I still think it's a great option. For a start, it's free. That's a big draw for me. I'm always looking for ways to save a bit of money. But also, because it's simple, and because it gives a relatively unadulterated conversion, fairly close to what you might get from a manual conversion, then it gives us a great base for editing. Let's jump into Negative Lab Pro. Sorry, not into Negative Lab Pro. Let's jump into Grain to Pixel and see how I use it. So we've got Photoshop open, and we're ready to do our conversion stage. Let's open Grain to Pixel. I have a keyboard shortcut. Don't worry too much about that little error that pops up. It started appearing recently, but it doesn't seem to cause any problems. So we want to choose our source file. There isn't too much to fiddle with. There aren't too many settings in Grain to Pixel. But basically we have source file, output folder. That makes sense. And then in conversion, we can do interactive crop, which is the setting I always go for. It means you can crop each frame as they convert to make sure you get the crop accurate. And we're going to do a manual film-based sampling. So that just means the edge of the film where there's no density, we can sample that manually to make sure we're getting the correct area. And I think it uses that sample to calculate how it's going to work out the conversion. In the conversion tab, I always have it set to Smart Color Cast Remove using the GTP engine. And then post-conversion, the only thing I've got set up here is an action for an auto white balance. I don't use it very often, but just once or twice when I've scanned like an expired roll or something where there's weird color casts going on, it just makes editing afterwards a little bit quicker for some frames if I use an auto white balance stage. Anyway, we're not going to use it today. So, come back to file setup. I've got a couple of files here on my desktop that we're going to convert, one black and white and one color, a 35 and a 120, so we get a little bit of variety. Just select them, and output folder, I'll stick them on my desktop as well. And we hit run. Okay, so it's opened up the first image, and it wants us to take a sample of the film base. So that's why in Epson Scan we left a little bit of a border, a little bit of an extra border around the image, because we can just drag up our crosshairs to that unexposed part of the film and hit enter. It's going to say, do you want to use this for all of the frames? Well, if I was converting an entire roll and it was all from the same roll, then I'd say yes, but of course we've got a black and white image and a color image here, so I'm going to click no this time. And it's going to tell me about the interactive crop. So I can just pull that down to there, pull that up to there, pull this in a little bit, pull this in a little bit. Don't have to be super precise because we can fix it later, but it just saves time if we get it right now.
Hit enter. Spins around for a few seconds. And there's our conversion. Very nice. Our next frame comes up, messes around a little bit, asks us again to take a sample. Drag that down to there. Drag that up to there. I should point out that for a lot of hobbyist photographers, especially film photographers who are already spending enough money on film, the idea of paying for an Adobe subscription isn't very appealing. And it doesn't appeal to me either. But these plugins for Lightroom, Photoshop, things like Negative Lab Pro and Grain to Pixel, they kind of hold us to the Adobe suite. I have come across another piece of conversion software that I don't remember the name actually, that didn't rely on the Adobe suite, and I was really excited because it was a one-off fee of like £20, £30 maybe. I thought, wow, fantastic, I can divorce myself from Adobe. But the results just weren't that good. So for now at least, we're kind of stuck with these options. Okay, so here we go. I say that of course because there are many other free or much cheaper or single payment editing suites like Affinity and Luminar and stuff that seem pretty good nowadays. Okay, so we can close Negative Lab Pro. Now we've got our two initial conversions. With our two conversions here, they actually look pretty good already, I think. But now we get into our editing stage. We're just going to take them and get these files ready for display. The goal of our conversion was to take our scanned negative and give us natural colors, nice tones, and plenty of detail. But the image isn't really ready for display just yet. Before we print it or share it on social media, we're probably going to do a little bit of editing. I know that editing film images is a controversial subject, and for me there's definite boundaries that don't want to be crossed. I've mentioned Nick Carver a couple of times. The guy's a bit of a legend in the film community, I think, and he did another great video just on this subject a few weeks ago about what he feels is okay and not okay in scanning. And probably for most of us, we fall somewhere in a slightly grey area of what we're comfortable doing and what we're not. To me, when I edit a film image, I want to fix any issues with the scan. I want to get an accurate version of what was on the negative. And I'm happy to tweak a little bit of exposure and a little bit of contrast. After all, that really is just interpretation of the negative. But I'm not happy wholesale changing colours or really messing around with exposure and contrast in too big a way. I like to try and be quite accurate with my exposures in camera. I generally use a spot meter, and I like to try and reflect as close as possible the qualities of the film that I'm using. And I said earlier that a scan is always just an interpretation of those qualities, so you can't get too dogmatic, but I like to try and get what I feel is a natural image. If you were printing these images, we'd probably be looking to make slightly different edits than if we're going to have them digitally displayed. Often print edits need to be a little bit more, sharpening than looks natural on a screen. They need a little bit more brightness than looks natural on a screen, because that will really help them to stand out off the paper. But this is going to be editing as if we're just displaying them digitally. So everybody has their own editing process in Photoshop and Lightroom. It's up to you. Personally, just because I've already got these as JPEGs here, I'm not going to bother opening Lightroom. I'm happy to edit them in Photoshop, but I am going to use Camera Raw. It gives nice, quick, easy, familiar edits. I think most of us find Camera Raw a nice place to edit our JPEG files. So I'm going to open up Camera Raw. And what's the first thing we're going to look at? Well, the first thing we want to do really is just take a little look at our exposure, contrast, and with colour film, our white balance too. Now in this case, I think our white balance is actually really nice. I've said that some grain to pixel conversions can come out a little bit cold and a little bit green. In this case, I don't think it's too bad. I might just add in a few points of warmth. Just like that. Just 5 points of warmth, I think. Let's just see what it looks like with a little bit more magenta. What do you think? Maybe a couple of points of magenta too. To me, that's quite natural. This was Fuji C200 film. Sorry about the name there. That's just because I didn't change the setting in grain to pixel that renames the files. But this is actually Fuji C200. So you're probably generally going to have quite a bright green palette anyway. But I think that's probably a nice colour palette by my eye, at least. Exposure is pretty good. Maybe a touch brighter. It feels like quite an airy photo. But only just a little bit. And then how do we need contrast? What do we think? Well, again, this is personal preference. I'm just going to add in a few points of contrast. That looks great. Now, I'm really happy with that. But one thing you'll notice, this isn't a very sharp image. Now, it's 35mm film, a consumer film at that, and I'm not sure, but this looks like it might have been shot at f4 or something. So it's probably not the sharpest image anyway. But I definitely feel like there's more sharpness to be brought out of this scan. Earlier, I talked about the difference between detail and sharpness. Now, what's that all about? Well, basically, detail is the number of, exactly that, details, small objects that are discernible in the grain of the film. Sharpness, though, is often how well those details are distinguished. So, actually, it comes down to how much contrast, micro contrast there is between the edges of one detail and another detail, or the background behind that detail. So, if we have sharpening in the scan, what we often end up with in the initial capture, what we often end up with is crunchy grain and details that do appear sharp, but as soon as we zoom in, actually just look mushy and full of jagged edges. We don't want that. Whereas compare here, if we zoom into this blank area of sky, the grain is barely noticeable. It's very fine. We want to maintain that as we sharpen the image. There's loads of sharpening tools available, especially in Photoshop. And I know a lot of people like to use smart sharpening in Photoshop. I've used that myself when I'm printing an image. But I actually find the detail tab in Camera Raw to be perfectly suitable for this kind of sharpening. The reason I like it is because we have this masking option. And this is how we're going to get a really nice detailed but not crunchy image. We're going to just hold the Alt key on our keyboard to see our mask. And we want to drag our masking up to a point where, not too far, but basically a point where we're not seeing any detail where there shouldn't be detail. So for example, there's some hazy clouds here, but we don't really want to sharpen those. They're supposed to be soft. So let's just have a look again at those. And as soon as they start dropping out, about there, that's probably where we're going to get nice sharpening. Now let's have a little look. Let's zoom into an area where we have lots of detail. And we start turning our sharpening up. Now if we go too far, wow, it can start to look a little bit almost like a painting, like a dot painting, which isn't what we want. But bring it back a little bit. Somewhere around there maybe. And when we zoom back out, now suddenly we've got an image that looks still natural, not crunchy, but actually lots of detail and lots of sharpness. Really nice. Just compare, if we bring the sharpening right back down, and then back up to about 55, I think in this case. It's going to look really good. Perfect. I'm very happy with that. Click OK. The filter applies. And at this point, we might just want to go through and check for any little imperfections. Perhaps any borders of the film that haven't been cropped out, any dust spots. In this case, it seems pretty much perfect. I'm very happy with that. There was no dust spots in this case because we had the ISRD, the digital ice, in the scanner being a color image. So that's made life a little bit easier. Great. Close that. Save it. Now the good thing is grain to pixel, it's not overwriting that initial negative capture. So we still have the digital negative. We've created a conversion and we've edited that conversion, we've saved it. So if you take a bit of time to set up your folders right, then you can end up with a folder with negatives ready to reconvert at a future time if you so desire, and converted scans ready to display. Okay, let's have a little look at this image. Well, straight away I think again this is a really nice conversion. It's looking excellent, but maybe we can do a few little adjustments to improve it. Let's open Camera Raw again, come back up to our basic tab. We haven't got to worry about colour and white balance here, but what about exposure and contrast? Well, the exposure seems good. Let's just add a few points of contrast. Nothing crazy. Again, this was a scene that was spot metered, so it was a pretty accurate exposure, and we're seeing the benefits of that now in the scan. This has come straight from Epson Scan into grain to pixel, and really very little is needed. If you've got a piece of film that was badly developed or badly exposed, this is where you're going to start finding yourself trying to mess around getting the contrast to look right, or getting the colour balance to look right. I think that contrast looks good. Let's just see what it looks like with a little bit more exposure. That might be nice. With black and white we can sometimes decide to push our whites or crush our blacks a little bit more, just slightly more granular cover of the contrast. I think that's okay. Perfect. I'm happy. Maybe just a touch brighter on the whites actually. Looks nice. We can see our clipping, but there's no clipping, so that's fine. As I said, grain to pixel can occasionally clip extreme highlights, so it is good just to keep an eye on your clipping warning. Okay, let's come back into the detail, have a little look at sharpening again. Again, we're going to use a mask. Now in this image we have the hard lines, but we also want to keep a little bit of detail in this texture of the concrete too. So let's bring our mask to maybe about there and apply some sharpening. If we just zoom in to where there's some details here. What do we think? Well, I think on a higher resolution file, like a 120 image, often you can get away with more sharpening, especially on a file like this where it is hard lines and there's no like facial features or delicate flowers or anything. They can look a bit nasty with too much sharpening, but I think in this case we can get away with quite a lot of sharpening, and that's going to give us a really nice detailed image. I'm happy with that. Okay, finally let's tidy up any little messy issues. I'm going to bring this brush down as small as I can get away with. That's about right. And now being black and white we weren't able to use ISRD, so I'd have cleaned the negative well, but there's still a few little problems. You can just go ahead and paint those out. Try and be accurate. I'm just doing this very quickly just so you can see what's going on. If this was an image that I was going to print, or if I wanted to be a bit more careful, then I'd definitely be zooming in and going over it kind of pixel by pixel, and I'd be using probably a smaller brush, and I'd be doing this a lot more carefully, but just for the sake of a demonstration, this gives you the idea. That's pretty good. That looks okay to me now. Maybe one or two little scratches, but that's fine. Again, I'm happy. Let's close it and click save and close Photoshop. And here we go. On our desktop we see the two original negative files that we had. Here they are. I'm not going to wait for them to load, because especially the 120 file, if we have a look, it's a pretty big old file. Plenty of detail and resolution in there. This will hurt your hard drive if you scan this way. And here's our conversions. Looking really, really nice. So to round up, what was the 3 stages of getting a great film scan? We want capture. We want a capture that doesn't have any nasties and has as much detail as possible. We want a nice conversion that gives us natural, editable files.
And we want an edit that gives us pleasing colours, the tones we're looking for, and ideally, great sharpness with minimal excess grain. Unless, of course, crunchy grain is what you're going for. Hopefully, these principles of scanning and some of the tips and tricks that I use that we've looked at today can be useful in helping you to get film scans that you're really happy with.